Can you hear me? Slyšíte mě? Pokud to si myslíte, že dnešní večer bude v češtině, musím vás hned zklamat. Bude v angličtině. This evening we're going to be speaking English. My name's David Vaughan. It's a great honor to be here to share this discussion and baptism of this really wonderful book. And I mean that very sincerely. The moment I started delving into the poems and the essays that accompany them, I was completely swept away. We're going to be hearing a lot of poetry this evening. We're going to have some talking about poetry as well. The poems are going to be read in Czech by the poet Petr Borkovec, whom I'm sure you all know. And we're going to hear poems in English translation, the same poems as translated by the poet Justin Quinn. And we're also going to be talking not just about the Catholic aspects of Bohuslav Reynek with Professor Martin C. Putna. There's a wonderful photograph there of Bohuslav Reynek in his farm, his little chateau in Petrkov. Here's another photograph of him huddled up, which I believe is a very typical image of Bohuslav Reynek. For those of you who don't know so much about him, I'd love it if Justin would start by giving us a little bit of background about Bohuslav Reynek and his extraordinary world.
Thank you, David. Well, for a long time, not many people knew about Reynek at all, even in this country. Or to say it more precisely, they knew about him in the 1920s, mainly as a translator. And he was an astonishing translator. He translated a huge amount and a huge variety of writers from French into Czech, and he then also translated a huge variety and quantity of writers from German. That he was fundamentally somebody at the beginning of his career who moved between languages, and it's, I suppose, my approach to him as a translator for myself is that he kind of found himself as a poet through translation. Unfortunately, then politics intervened, as they have a habit of doing in the 20th century in Europe, and from about the Second World War on, his reputation as a poet really went underground. It wasn't yet the underground that I'm sure many of you know from the 1970s here. He was unknown, but he continued writing. He had difficulty publishing it, and it wasn't really until the end of his life in the 1960s did he gain some level of small acclaim among a group of Czech writers in the younger generation who used to go down to his farmstead in Petrkov, which is just outside Havlíčkův Brod, and would pay homage to the master there. And of course, he wasn't just a writer and a translator, but a really integral part of this book is to present some of his work as an artist, a visual artist. This is the first outing, really, of Reynek to this whole extent, both as an artist and a selection of his work stretching over most of his career. There was one publication of fish scales, really Choupinné, about almost 20 years ago now in the United States. Those were his prose poems, but these are his poems proper, if you like. The prose poems were from the early part of his career, and one big question for me was, and one question that a lot of people asked me when they heard I was translating it, they said, well, which Reynek are you translating? And I said, mainly the later stuff, because I think for a lot of Czech readers, what's of crucial importance is the book that he published in 1925, Rety a zuby, what is it, Lip by Teeth, as I translated it into English. That was an explosion of expressive, imaginative imagery in those poems of 1925. They're almost, in some respects, like sci-fi, something you would see in a sci-fi movie like Alien. When he describes a woman's hair, you almost leap from your chair in the shocking expressivity of those works. But what happened then later in his career, I translated a few of those, but what happened later in his career is that he settled down into a very kind of classic, restrained form, almost as Martin Putna says in his essay in the book, kind of erasing himself almost as a subject in the poems. You see kind of glimpses, you see a kind of the shadow of a shoulder going by, and you take it to be Reynek's. But there's this marvelous erasure of his self in the later works, and by erasing himself, he lets so many other things shine through. What kind of things? Well, first of all, marvelous things, and I mean that in the old meaning of the word, really, things that are from the life of the spirit. And now that can put a lot of people off if, in this predominantly secular age. But for me, what was really striking is the way that he grounds all the life of the spirit in the everyday objects around him in the farmstead in Petrkov. So it's really, that for me is perhaps the most striking and marvelous aspect of his work in the last 3 to 4 decades, and what initially attracted me as a translator. I don't know if that answers some of the questions, but
maybe also
you mentioned the politics that got in the way, as it were. I mean, he had an extraordinary fate, didn't he? For those few probably who don't know here in the audience, of having his own family's farm taken away, confiscated, and then himself working on his own farm as a labourer, which left him profoundly isolated, didn't it? But also that isolation, as I think you comment in your essay, in a sense fed his creativity.
Yeah, it's a type of concentration, lyric concentration, that I think would destroy perhaps a different poet, a different writer, a different artist. But in his case, his life after the Second World War under communism was extremely difficult. He didn't want to leave the farm in Petrkov. He was deeply emotionally attached to it. It belonged to his parents. And he more or less, brought his French wife over there. And she kind of stuck here when communism came, and her longing for her homeland in France grew. But I think what the Reynek as a formal poet really finds most freedom within very short lines, rhymes that are very tight, syntax that is extremely muscular. And within those confines, I think, are echoed really in the confines, the physical confines of his life after the Second World War in this country. They really fed into it, like one fed the other, and vice versa.
I think there's nothing worse than
talking for hours about poetry without actually hearing any poetry. So we're going to hear a poem first in the original Czech, Blázen. Is it a fool? Yeah. A fool. Which I think is a poem which also says something about how Reynek perceived himself in Petrkov, but of course a great deal more than that.
Blázen. Lázencem ve své vsi, znají mne smutní psy, bílí psi ospalí, plynoucí do dály, žádný z nich neštěká. Těší mne zdaleka, jsou to psi oblaka, běží a nekvílí. Smutkem jsme opilí, kam jdeme, nevíme. Požehnej duši mé, pastýři prastarí s hlubokými dary, měsíce a bdění. Strny na temeni těžkém, rozbodaném jako srdce. Amen.
A fool. In my village, I'm the fool. Sad dogs know me. Sad white school of sleepy dogs that drift away into the distance. They don't bay. They keep me happy from afar. Cloudish dogs is what they are, that run about the skies massive. And we're all drunk on grief. Where we wander, we don't know. Ancient shepherd, as I go, bless my soul with your great gifts of moon and these long wakeful shifts, heavy, gashed time and again, like a bleeding heart. Amen.
By the way,
I don't know if you've all got one of these. The poems that we're hearing in the course of this evening are all in this little booklet, which is there for you to take. Are there any copies left?
Yes.
If anybody who doesn't have one and would like to actually follow the poems, how many copies are there? Which also gives me a chance, while we're doing that, also what I didn't do at the beginning, is to thank the Václav Havel Library. Thank you, Joachim, for the fact that we're here today, and to thank the Carolinum Press for this beautiful book, and it's beautifully produced as well. And also, I should mention the one person who had a major role in this book, who is not on the podium now, is Jiří Šerých, who wrote both commentaries on the etchings which are in the book, and also he wrote one of the 3 essays. The authors of the other 2 essays are sitting next to me. Martin Janeček also pointed out the major role played by the designer of the book, Jiří Vaughan. Is he here? There's so many hands up. Anyway. Okay. Have you run out of copies? Now, the more serious vein. We're going to return to Justin again in a little while to talk about what it was like translating a poet who is simple and yet incredibly difficult to translate. I'd now like to ask Martin C. Putna to talk a little bit about the background of the context of Bohuslava Reynek in the Christian Catholic context in which he was writing. You used a rather wonderful term in your essay, talking about what seems like a paradox, a reactionary counterculture. So please tell us more.
Good evening to all. It is my extreme pleasure to listen to our British friends when they talk about...
British. Sorry. I apologize.
I missed that. What was that? It's the second time I spent someone's evening this evening.
Okay.
I'm British.
Sorry. Anyway, to listen our friends who have the privilege to have no preconception about Reynek, to have no stereotypes about Reynek, because according to my opinion, the biggest trouble about Reynek in this country is not that he is not known enough, not published enough, that his works are not appreciated enough in the art market. No, the trouble is completely opposite. The trouble consists in those stereotypes, namely that Reynek became in the last few years a sort of cult figure. I think you remember 2 or 3 years ago the huge exhibition which pretended to open something hidden, something prohibited, etc., etc., but the goal was absolutely opposite, namely purely commercial. And I had the opportunity to ask Reynek's son Daniel and Jiří what would their father say about this Barnum advertisement on Czech highways? And they answered very, very simply, calmly, as they usually did. Well, we believe he wouldn't care. He wouldn't care. And I think this is one of the keys to the Reynek. He did not care, but we do care, and we have to care about the background and about the stereotypes. And the stereotype, which was repeated again and again in the former Czech Reykology, consists in the simple thesis that Reynek is a poet of faith, and that he is a poet of farmyard. Both is not completely untrue, but it is too big reduction of the Reynek's poetry, of the originality. Because believe me, when I was writing almost 30 years, 3 volumes of Czech Catholic literature, I had to read hundreds and hundreds of volumes proclaiming that this is the poetry of faith, and this is a poetry of a farmyard, and poetry of good little things, cats and windows and virgin and sorrows, and about humility and sorrow, anxiety, etc., etc. And about 3/4 of all this is just, well, how to say it politely. In German, there is a wonderful term for it: Epigonentum. How would you translate it in English? Epigonentum.
I'm supposed to be a Germanist, but I can't.
Okay, well, but just imitation, just proclamation. Just we are the Catholic poets, so we write about our faith, about Virgin Mary, maybe about apocalypse, and perhaps about Reynek. And especially in the last decade of the history of Czech Catholic poetry, namely in the 80s, there was a whole generation of young poets for whom Reynek appeared to be their greatest master in this simplicity. And they tried to imitate this simplicity, but they were not able to, because this is only seeming simplicity. Reynek's, if we, unfortunately he's no whiteboard, but if I had opportunity to have a pen and write something, I would show you a very broad context in the beginning, which is the all the influences on early Reynek, namely symbolism, expressionism, Trakl, Sharpegi, etc., etc. And then the strange being on the imaginary whiteboard is going and developing like that. at the end, you have this seeming simplicity. But the simplicity is illusion, because the simplicity is full of allusion, of hints, of things and motifs which are hidden inside the poetry. Which is why someone who, however talented he or she is, being 20, simply cannot, well, he can imitate it, but he or she cannot achieve the same, because it is, as Henry David Thoreau said, this simplify. This is the final, the ultimate Reynek is a final point of this process of simplification. And what was in the beginning? In the beginning was the term that David named, well, repeating my term, reactionary counterculture. The term counterculture, horrible term, counterculture is connected, as you probably know, with the name of American anthropologist Theodor Roszak, of Polish origin, living in California in the 60s, and the term was connected in the beginning with the young left-wing movement in the 60s. The movement hoping to transform completely the old bourgeois world into something new, into something better, communitarian, full of love, etc., etc. Okay, but the same Theodor Roszak says in the Forming of Counterculture book that the early Christianity in first 3 centuries of the Christian era was a sort of counterculture because it was underground, it was prohibited, it was risky to be Christian in those first 3 centuries, and no one who would build a career wasn't a Christian. After the Constantine change, Constantine turn in the 4th century, Christianity started to build traditional world. But in the beginning, it was not about tradition. It was about breaking with the tradition. It was about breaking the rules of the world. The Christianity was a revolutionary force, not the traditional force. And in the 19th century, the several groups in France and in England tried to revive the contemporary Catholicism somehow, feeling that that the world came into the situation of the beginning of the situation of when Christianity is again in a position of minority. And the only chance is to revive this original strength. And either they succeed in transforming the world again, or the apocalypse will come. And the initial point of Czech Catholic counterculture is the building of an apocalyptic sect. Josef Florian, when he started in the village Stará Říše, his publishing house, he did not want to start publishing house. He believed, truly, literally believed, that apocalypse is about to come, and the books he is translating and publishing are the books which shall be saved when the apocalypse come. And the beginnings of Reynek work in the field of translation was connected with this publishing house. So it was not for the culture's sake. It was for the salvation's sake. Why Reynek started translating. And this is why his early work is so full of, we can say, ideology. Those early poems are full of, definitely, of fire, of this initial enthusiasm, of excitation, etc., etc. But this is not the Reynek, which then was discovered as the cult author in 60s, let alone then in the 80s. Or this was just a preparation. Only when this initial enthusiasm slowly was calming down, and all this ideology, all this apocalyptic imaginary started to be hidden in his poetry, then the new, old, grown-up Reynek started to emerge, and this process of simplification started. And final point of my speech. I'm sorry, I started the lecture. Sorry, I lecture at the end. But the final point. But why the poets, writers, artists in 60s, and especially why the musicians of the underground movement in 70s were able to discover Reynek and to learn to love him, because he was in the position of someone who lives the underground situation and who has endured so much, and then he is a model of this completely independent human and artistic situation, and someone who still in the poetry and in the visual work possess something of the initial strength of this counterculture. Because the underground movement in 70s, represented by people like Magor and Jiří Němec, Věra Jusová and others, they felt themselves to be Christians, and underground movement
za lesem v šepotu lété.
The title of this poem is the name of the street where Suzanne Reynek, his Reynek's wife, lived in Grenoble, where she grew up as a girl, and hence you have the French word, the second last word of the poem is in French, lait, milk. Now daylight isn't far. The street is misted silk. Led by no morning star, the children go for milk. Heedless of paradise, they stand on its threshold. From window panes, they prize each one a coin of gold. These lights in children's hands along the street unfurl, and the surrounding lands fade to the underworld. And on the panes, 2 obols left for us to take down, here in this vale of cobbles, here in the misted dawn. We'll take them on long roads entranced across the lea, round waters, through woods, whispering, lay, lead thee.
Dveře. Jsou dveře, veřeje, je podupaný práh, je zámek, klíč a klika. Práh čeká na poutníka, poslední naděje. Vyklíčí v síni hrách hodin čekání, běd zemí vyseté, úponky setkání, rám dveří oplete. Hrách pátků, nedělí, na kterém klečeli poutníci s prázdnou lžicí, kající, nekající. Chlad kliky zahřeje let nalomených paží doutnáním naděje. Hrách voný na zápraží. Rám dveří oplete přízraky zakleté, chlad kliky bez dlaní, práh planých čekání, klíč v zámku zrzavělý, již mrtví zapomněli.
Door. Here is the door, and here the threshold carved with ware, the handle, lock and key. The pilgrim, where is he? At last is hope now near. The peas sprout in the room, for each one hours of waiting, the woes like grain in ground. And do the tendrils, meeting, wreathe the doorway round? Fridays, Sundays, peas to try the pilgrim's knees, their spoons empty and bright. Who knows, are they contrite? Their broken arms, though colder, can melt the handle's hoar with hope, the slightest smoulder. Pea fragrance at the door. These wraiths wreathe their way round, the doorway here spellbound. The handle still ice cold, the waiting on the threshold. With rust, the key is burnt, the lax dead left unturned. We're going to stop reading poems for a bit. And, I'm supposed to stop at this poem and say what it's like to translate Reynek. And the first thing I'd like to say is bloody awful. And you know, the thing about translating from Czech is that you can get away with murder because most people around the world don't speak Czech. But I'm in a really bad position in this room here because you guys all speak English and a lot of you guys speak Czech as well. So I'm going to get away with very little today. We shouldn't have had the en face translations. But I think what the en face translation really shows is the amazing compression you can get in Czech. I was just looking at the lengths of the lines. The English lines are just stretching all over the page, and they're trimeter lines, like just to be technical at the moment, you know, poets and translators of poetry live and die for this sort of thing, trimeters, to quote Joseph Brodsky. We care a lot about this. There's just 3 beats in the line. It's like dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. That's a really short line in English, but that's already 6 syllables. That. In a lot of my lines, this can be 6 words even. And you look at what Reynek's getting away with, sometimes he's just got 2 words in a line. Which means that in the original, they seem like just economically in the original. And what, from my point of view as a poetry reader, what it also does is it pulls against the force of the syntax. You know, when you're reading a sentence, you're driven forward by the syntax. You want to get the sense of the sentence. But by having such short lines with just 2 lines in it, he's pulling really hard against that, which creates this amazing tension and dynamic in the poem. And then when you translate into English, you have to put in all this junk, like prepositions, pronouns, and stuff like that. And suddenly you have a cluttered junk shop there. What was just, you know, beautiful Italian modern design with just 1 piece of furniture in it. So that's what I have to say about translation. Sorry.
So little. I mean, one way I think you're doing English a great injustice, actually. There's a great beauty in the little 1-syllable words that jump from one to the next in English. Which, you know, Shakespeare sonnets all in words of 1 syllable, etc., etc. It's the other pendulum swing the other way, let's say. And one way that you've solved that is when I was reading the poetry in your translations, I recognised a lot of how can I put it, little references to English language poets who obviously you felt were in some way close to Reynek. And for example, when I was listening to the Cockerels, it almost felt like a kind of expressionist parody of Gerard Manley Hopkins' Windhover, all about the dappled dawn drawn falcon, you know, these 2 cockerels. It was sort of similar but the opposite. And there are lots of places where, you know, or vocabulary, you know, words like the Lee, which makes me think of the elegy written in a country churchyard, you know, very famous English poem about the cows lowing over the Lee, I can't remember. Yeah. And so I would like to ask you about this, the way that you carried the Czech poetry into a context that is, let's say, identifiable to English readers, but without actually creating something that's radically different.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's an act of imagination that you imagine who Reynek, which poets Reynek would get on with in English. You imagine who he would find things in common, whether it's imagery of the countryside or whether it's religious ideas, and you try to steer it in that direction. With Hopkins, it was absolutely deliberate on my part. I stole certain, you might say, hot words for Hopkins. Gash is a really hot Hopkinsian word, and he loves that, and vermilion and all that sort of thing. So I would drop also Edward Thomas and Robert Frost. I would try to make them resonate with those writers. Now, that you could say that's just all in my head, and of course it was. It wasn't in Reynek's head. He didn't know these writers, I presume. For all his linguistic abilities, I don't think he had much grasp of the English poetry tradition. But that was my approach. My other approach was to bring it into rhyme as well. I felt that Reynek, so much of the beauty of his poems resides in his handling of rhyme. It's amazing the way he plays the sentence and the lines off the rhyme. So that had to be reproduced. And that not the rhythm. I say God because you just can't get Czech rhythm into English. For Czech people, dactylic or trochaic is a normal rhythm. So a dactyl is like da 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 da. But you do that in English, and you sound like the worst writer of birthday card rhymes, you know, or limericks or something like that. So you really don't want to do that to Mr. Reynek if you like him. So you have to shift it to those rhythms that you feel that you imagine he would have chosen if he'd been writing in English. So a trimeter rhyme, iambic for the most part, but with trochee. I mean, it's getting very technical now, I know. So one time in 10 years I get to talk about this sort of thing in public. So.
And also, I mean, but there is something you mentioned.
So sort of like Edward Thomas or Robert Frost. There's one word that I think you use, or another critic used about Reynek as a compliment. The word cloddish. They use the word lapidary. This sort of quite heavy language. These words that sort of are almost awkward, which is, I think, something that I recognise in someone like Edward Thomas as a poet, and I love.
Yeah.
This kind of using some quite sort of unpoetic, down-to-earth language in ways that is profoundly poetic, and I think that's something that is very common with Reynek, isn't it?
It's a force. He pushes back to aestheticized vocabulary, and he brings it back down. I mean, cloddish is it's a translation of the word nehorabany in Czech, which was used to describe him by one critic. But clod in English is great because it's also a clod of earth. It's bringing him down to the earth. It's awkward on the one hand, but it's as though he has too much mud on his boots and he's going around like that. So it's paradoxically, I think, in this critic's description, and I think it's a fair one, it becomes a term of praise, actually, paradoxically.
I think it's high time we heard some more
poetry. We're going to hear now 3 more poems, starting with Match in a Puddle, Sirka v louži.
Sirka v louži. Černá půl, půl bílá. Bárka bídy muší. Měla z ohně duši, už jí vysvítila. Neví kdy a komu. Třeba na hodiny, mezi stíny viny. Snad na cestu domů. Černá, bílá pěna, osten v dřímotmáku. Peří, dej si ptáku. Sirka zahozená. Smrtka po tabáku.
Match in a puddle. One black half, one half white. The fly's bark and its pyre. The match, a soul on fire. Gone out now, it might have taken hours, thus drowned among the guilty shadows. When and whose, who knows? Maybe homeward bound. Black foam and foam that's white, a pang that poppies home, a feather, its bird has flown just where, match thrown aside, the reaper's one small bone.
Husa v mlze. Nehoří a nevyzvání. Husa volá v mlze raní. Úpí za zdí husa syrá, bráno zimy otevírá, skřípou samot veřeje. Klika bílá vede je z naděje do naděje. K soudu budí výkřik husy, opuštěný dvůr. Sad rusí, kameny a kolena, o samotu opřená. Husa bílá, husa sivá, křídla mlhy, křídla divá. Smrt si bílý nůž ohřívá, srpe kluny o tmu brousí, jdou. Nic sebou nevezmou si, zeď. A na zdi stromů čela, bytím o zeď skrvavělá, za zdí záhad zahrada. Zčernal strom, krev opadá.
Goose in mist. It neither burns nor gives a warning. A goose is calling out this morning. Behind the wall, lamenting fate, thus it opens winter's gate. The doorpost creaks in solitude. The white door handle shifts the mood from hope to hope, and unsubdued, the calling wakes the empty yard to judgment and the russet orchard. It also calls the stones and knees that take in solitude their ease. Goose, so ashen white its shade, its wings of mist, so wildly splayed. Death is warming its white blade, a sickle sharpened to dark rhythm. They go, they take nothing with them. The wall and trees, foreheads smashed against the wall. Blood is splashed. Behind this wall a mystery, the blood a trickle, a blackened tree.
Tyčky v plotě. Osiřelé tyčky v plotě, němé struny přibité, mnoho víte o samotě, o křídlech nevíte. Stébla, kterým se po klasu vyslyšení nestýská, bez tváře jste, bez úžasu, vyděšená strněska. Hubených let holé hnáty, do čekání zajaté, suky v dlaních, v hlíně paty, kolena nemáte.
Sticks in a fence. The fence is sticks, like strings subdued, forlorn, tacked in a row. There's much you know of solitude, of wings, what do you know? The straws of wheat don't miss the ears that heard and were heard too. You're faceless, unastonished, fears this latter math chilled through. These lean long years, your bony shanks, waiting, locked in leaves, pearls in palms, heels in mud banks, you don't have any knees.
I absolutely love the translation of that last poem, and if you want to read a bit more about the process of translating that, in his essay at the end of the book, Justin does talk about this, translating this particular poem. I actually want to slightly leave a planned itinerary, because one thing I think we can't talk about this book and ignore the fact that there are several poems by Suzanne Renaud in it. Suzanne Renaud was Bohuslav Reynek's wife through all the long, difficult period, including after the Second World War. And there are several poems by her in this anthology. I'd like to ask you a little bit about that, and maybe I think it would be nice to hear at least one of the poems.
It was, although I have schooled French, I decided it was best not to translate them, that it would be better to get another poet to translate these. So an Irish poet, David Wheatley, translated 4 poems by Suzanne Renaud. The story of of her poetry and her life together with Reynek, I think, is a very interesting one that played out as well in the lives of their 2 sons, Jiří and Daniel, who it was Jiří who was the translator, wasn't it? Daniel was a photographer, and they lived. The house was francophone as well. And it was a deep engagement because of who she was and the way she brought up her children. It was like a small embassy of French culture in the middle of the Czech Highlands, and that we can read one of the poems if you like. Or was that what you were thinking of?
I was thinking maybe a nice idea.
Yeah, sure, okay.
Sorry to spring
yeah,
this.
no, it's fine.
It occurred to me.
I just got this book in my hands today, so I don't know where they are. But they were rushed from the printers we were told, for this evening. Okay. But David Wheatley is an Irish poet, but he lives in Scotland, and he uses Scots English. That's not the right description, but it's a variation of English. Some people say it's a separate language now. And he has dropped certain kind of Scots words in the translations as well. It's a really difficult thing to know how to do, to translate into English. Because the first thing you have to decide is which English. Are you going to American English, English, and there are so many different Englishes as well. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea. Weirishal tree. Weirishal tree, the last rays of the sun have bathed gently in their solemn light. Burning bush, abandoning tonight the earth you always lay so barely on. Tragic and denuded Marie Celeste of the teeming dark and the fog and wind on riverbanks in evening shade, but bound elsewhere, swept on in search of kingdoms lost. Still for now your scarlet mantle billows over the heart that scents our coming loss, impassively. And all our noisy cares are birds lingering in terminal bliss, in your cage of light with its fine gold bars.
Martin Putna doesn't want to say anymore, but I would like to ask him, because he was going to talk about Cohoti, the cockcrows, which was, of all the poems, it was the one that seemed to arouse the strongest response among you. So I will ask you about that poem at least.
So, I decided, when it comes to Cohoti, to read the part of my essay which describes this period of Reynek's work. Yeah, this is it. Post-conversion anxiety is still present in the lip by tooth. Now, however, it is no longer experienced as endurable torment. On the contrary, it is gradually accepted as a permanent state, residing deep in the spirit, a state which is allotted by God to the poet. In this book, for the first time, the small world of the village regularly appears, any part of which, an animal, tree, signs of the season or time of day, points to God's order and the damaged nature of earthly existence, for instance in Dawn in Winter, Idyll, Morning, Flying Lamb, Ducks in the Yard, Stump in the Fire, and The Yard in April. There is no straightforward nature description. The eponymous kid goats of one poem lead the poet to remember the blessing of Isaac in the Old Testament, the motif of the goat skin which disguised Jacob. Roosters remind us of Peter's denial of Jesus, the willow shoots of Christ arriving on Palm Sunday riding a donkey, the animal young condemned to death, a symbol of all humanity. In contrast with the preceding phases, the latitude of poetic concentration has contracted. We are not yet finally in the Petrikov farmyard, as in the later collections. It is still possible to wander out and return, whether via a distracted memory or a poetic motif from another country or cultural milieu. However, the narrow way lay clearly ahead. In the spiritual subsoil of Lip by Tooth, we can distinguish three motifs of Florianesque apocalypse from the conversion phase. They have, however, undergone de-apocalyptization. The iconographic Pietà remains one of the key images of Reynek's inner landscape, but the doleful Madonna has lost her original connection with the apocalyptic Virgin Mother of La Salette and remains only a traditional symbol of pain, sympathy and consolation pertinent to every human life. The Pentecostal motif of the Holy Spirit's flames has almost completely disappeared. The only trace is the redness we find in several poems. This is most striking in the later collection, False Butterflies, where redness, in a motif of fire or blood, the burning bush, the crimson heart, fire longing, etc., concludes the greater part of the poems. The redness always signifies hopes amidst anxiety and resistant to logic and probability, hope that comes with the now it has happened death of Christ, and now it approaches death of man. The third apocalyptic motif, that of waiting, has not disappeared, but has changed in nature. Before, he was situated in the early 20th century, waiting for the end of the world. Now, it shifts to the humble level of the individual's salvation. This is also a move from history to meta-history. From the new apocalypse of Florian back to the older, traditional and familiar apocalypse, which the holy days remind the Catholic faithful. Thus Reynek, in his major and late phases, is drawn rather to All Souls, the feast of Christ the King, and Advent rather than Pentecost. That is, times and feast days that have an aspect of quiet, humble waiting.
Thank you. And of course, the cockerels, there's also an obvious reference to France there as well. It's not definitely not by chance.
I didn't spot that.
Well, we've managed to do something quite astonishing actually. It's like, can you talk about William Blake for more than 10 minutes without talking about his painting? We've actually managed to talk for an hour and a quarter about Bohuslava Reynka without talking at all about Bohuslava Reynka as an artist, which I think is possibly not a bad thing, because there's been a lot of talk about Bohuslava Reynka as an artist recently, as we were hearing about the rather massive exhibition of his work recently. What I would like to do before we finish, if anybody has any questions, comments, or anything that's inspired them, or that they disagree with, or if they spotted any mistakes in the translation.
I do not want to know.
Sorry. Okay.
I had some feelings about the poetry of Susanna, which you read, and I would like to know. Yeah?
I just said that I had a kind of feeling after all we read the Reynek, and then we moved to the Susanna. It's like kind of moving lyric dancing next to his poem, so I wanted to know kind of more, maybe a little bit about her poetry, like in relation to his poetry.
I'm the last person you should ask. I have, when I work as a translator, I kind of have really tunnel vision like that, and because her work is in French, I kind of excluded it from my horizon of vision, and so I'm really embarrassed that I'm not able to say anything more. Yeah.
I mean, I think also, there are lots of
French references. There's some obvious French references to François Villon, with the contrast of the black and the white and the fly and the milk, etc. I'm sure there are loads more that probably, we need to sort of start again and do another type of translation, but to sort of focus on the French, wouldn't it? And this is a never-ending process of translation, part of which you talk about wonderfully in your essay at the end of the book, in fact.
I looked at her poetry from the point of view of how he translated it, and I was really interested to see what he allowed himself to do as a translator. He could be quite cavalier. It was interesting. So I was not paying much attention to the originals at all. I mean, I was catching the meaning, but it was more to see how he worked and how he brought, dealt with certain techniques from French into Czech. So
there's another question behind.
The poems you've translated are really wonderfully rendered in English, but just looking at this facing page, I noticed that you've made a number of formal decisions beyond just using rhyme, but you end in the last poem, for example, one line with question mark, where in the facing it's not. You shift the punctuation. Some lines in the original are in stop phrases or complete sentences where the line sort of in jams or carries over in English. Can you talk a little bit about those decisions?
Again, they are totally cavalier in many respects. That the shape of an English sentence is so different from that of a Czech. Czechs punctuate in a different way, just on that principle level. But it's also a question of how the meaning of the line plays off the end of the line. And sometimes you have to punctuate differently and bring a sentence to an end. And to bring in certain emphases that don't come through if you followed the Czech word order. So I would have no theory about it, but sometimes I would follow the Czech quite faithfully, but other times I felt that just to make the English work, I would have to chop up the sentences, give it a different rhythm of thought. And I think that's what punctuation really is. It's a rhythm of thought. It's a rhythm of pauses that is. So that's no theory, just different. I felt the force, to use the Star Wars. You're looking at me in a dissatisfied way, and I'm thinking, I have not answered your question.
That's the question, which is
To all of you, really, I have a slight feeling that the poems are easier to understand in English than in Czech. I'm not sure about that. And obviously, there's lots of people here who are more or less fluent in both languages. That was my gut feeling, but I can't say, as a non-native Czech speaker, I can't say. I don't know, would anybody agree? No.
I had kind of the same feeling, and it's also that like the two versions, the Czech one and the English one, reading them both like helps me understand the poems even deeper. Like if I would read only one, it would seem as something would be lost. Like of course I'm not an expert on Reynek. I know not as anything near as much as you all do. But for me it was much easier to understand if I read both versions.
Well, there's a kind of basic sense in which a translation is a commentary on the original. And that it offers a kind of amplification of certain things that lie dormant in the original. You always hope that you don't explain too much, what is left unexplained in the original. It's a huge danger for translators. But I agree, and I often find myself reading French poetry in exactly that way, that the English translation of it helps me not just to understand the original, but it seems like the poem has become larger in a way, and so.
You mentioned he was a Catholic poet. Can you say something more about that and how that influenced?
Okay, I'll repeat the question. That he was a Catholic poet and how that influenced his poetry. It is impossible to imagine him as a poet without Catholicism. It is integral to everything he writes about. In occasional poems, I have to say that the ones that I really wasn't drawn to so much to translate, he writes about places of pilgrimage, of Catholic places of pilgrimage, like La Salette in France. I did translate that one, but it is... I really can't disconnect his Catholicism from his pastoralism, his work as a farmer and his observation of the landscape. It does seem that in the poem Shadows that we read out, that the whole world of the cattle byre and the farmyard, he makes it shimmer on this edge. Martin earlier talked about this edge between ideology and religion. For me, in that poem, there's kind of... Reynek goes right to the edge of the physical world and gives you these slight glimpses into what may lie beyond. For me, coming from Ireland, it was totally weird. I have to say, Ireland is not connected, the Catholic Church in Ireland is not connected really with intellectual and cultural life at all. And so... I could repeat the point, but I mean that maybe I am exaggerating slightly, but I'm exaggerating in contrast to a place like France. France, intellectual and cultural life is deeply connected with Catholicism. And so it was a shock for me to arrive here in the early 90s, where you'd meet cultural people, intellectuals, who would say, yeah, I'm a Catholic. And I go, are you crazy? You can't be a Catholic and a cultural person. This don't go together. Do you know the rules of the Catholic Church? So what I had to do was unlearn a lot of my prejudices when I came along to try to understand his poetry and to see the way he was working with it.
Somebody at the back.
Hello. Okay. Justin, just to say congratulations on the translations. Until a few days ago, I'd never heard of Reynek, and from what I've heard and read a little bit, he's obviously a major poet of the 20th century in Europe. So an amazing achievement. But to continue what you were saying, you've actually half answered my question. When Martin was speaking, I had exactly the same thoughts as you. Coming from the most Catholic country in the world at one stage, the idea of a Catholic writer was such a bizarre notion.
You see, it's not just me. He's Irish too.
If you're a writer, it means you're literate and you have a certain amount of reason. So, like yourself, I had the same experience when I encountered French writers who were Catholic writers. And I thought, how is this humanly possible? Especially because the writers were people like Claudel or Peggy, who were associated with extreme right-wing political views, which is a point that could be discussed. But in Irish literature, of course, we do have a certain amount of Catholicism. There's a kind of the mystical Mariology in Knihovně, and a kind of vestigial, truculent Ulster papism in Seamus Heaney. But how did you deal with that Catholic aspect? Did you just deliberately choose poems that didn't involve it, or not? Now I know that this is a different cultural context where Catholicism is counterculture. Do you understand my question?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
It's a tough one.
It's, sometimes you just have to close your eyes and translate. And you might deeply disagree with what is going through your brain from one language to the other, but you got to shut yourself up at that moment and let it flow through you rather than editorialize. Like I say, when I presented the list of poems I've translated to Martin about a year or two ago, he said, well, you might also consider translating these other 6 poems. And I looked at the list and I went, yeah, those are the ones. So I did translate some of those, but some of them were a bit too much for me.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, again, an amazing achievement.
Thank you very much.